And welcome back to the second segment of episode 8 of Security and Compliance Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, joined with my co-hosts, Scott, Josh, and Matt. So, our first segment, we listened to Russell and Jim give some fairly practical advice, I thought, about how to sort of take a top-down approach and build a security program at a smaller company or a company with a limited budget. And I promised that we would have a chance to have a follow-up discussion with these guys, give a chance to do some Q&A with them. Before we jump into that, do have a couple more announcements. First one is if you guys are planning to attend the RSA conference in 2020, which is February 24th through 28th next year, we encourage you to come out. Security Weekly is going to be there. I think we're going to be in Media Alley, and we're hoping that we can record several of our shows out there, possibly including this one. If you sign up now or sign up before January 24th, you can get a full conference pass at a $900 early bird discount. And if you want to save an extra $150, you can go to our wiki notes and copy the code, but I will tell it to you right now. It's code 5 Oscar Uniform Sierra Whiskey Kilo Lima Yankee Foxtrot Delta. Like I said, go to the wiki and copy it down, but we can give you an extra $150 off the cost of your RSA ticket. Finally, we are preparing at Security Weekly for our holiday extravaganza, which will be on December 19th. Most of the hosts and our friends and family are going to be descending to G Unit Studios in Rhode Island, and we are planning on doing a day-long streaming of 5 separate 1-hour panel discussions on a whole plethora of security topics. And I think security and compliance is even going to make one of the sessions. So be sure to join us if you can remotely. We're going to be on the YouTube channel, and you can follow along live. Also, on December 19th, Ed Scotus will join us, and he will give us all the things we need to know about the annual CounterHack Holiday Hack Challenge. So hope to see you there on December 19th. Okay, announcements are over. Let's jump into it. Gentlemen, my co-hosts, anyone have any initial questions, comments for Russell and Jim?
I'd love to jump in quickly. Look, I like the way you approach this because I think one thing that people forget about is the order sometimes of how to approach a security program. And I think the NIST cybersecurity framework does a really good job of laying out kind of those core kind of areas, domains that you really need to focus on, right? You start with identify. What do I have? What do I have to protect? What's the criticality of it? I think a lot of people skip that step. But it's pretty important if we think about an organization that has limited resources. If we don't have a really good understanding of inventory and where critical assets are, applying protection, detection, response, and recover gets really, really hard or really, really expensive because you're not focused on the right stuff. So I like the way you approached it because I think the NIST cybersecurity framework does a really good job of giving you the 5 steps and kind of the order that you need to approach a security program with.
Thanks for that feedback. It's good.
I agree. Thank you.
I agree and I disagree, and I want to bring up I'll try to put it in the form of a question, but and a caveat is as you went through the whole 5 categories based on this cybersecurity framework. Me, Mr. PCI, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, that's in PCI. Yeah, that's in PCI. Yeah, that's in PCI. I mean, it's all in PCI. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I think is missing from the NIST cybersecurity framework, and correct me if I'm wrong, is what I would categorize as simply asking the question before you do that whole exercise of what it is you're trying to protect. And that is, encouraging companies and organizations to figure out what it is that they have that's valuable in terms of information and data, and to some degree, maybe categorize it and classify it. But my problem with the NIST cybersecurity framework and a lot of other compliance regimes is they sort of approach it, at least this is my impression, of sort of a blanket, we must secure everything, we must protect everything to the same degree, rather than, and you sort of introduced it at the beginning, you just didn't follow up on it, the idea of defense in depth and least privilege, which I think have to do with understanding where your sensitive data is, your most critical data assets, and then of course what information assets are being used to house the data assets. So hopefully you get the essence of my question. But my question is essentially, why aren't we starting with what is it we're trying to protect? What is it we're trying to do?
Yeah, I think we are in Identify. We didn't really get in and walk through the entirety of the cybersecurity framework. But if you dive in, if you download it and take a read through that, I think that is the point, is identifying where your data is, where your risks are, what are your devices, what are your networks, mapping it all out in order to conduct that risk assessment and apply controls. And, it doesn't specifically prescribe as much as things like PCI does, like 853 FISMA does. It's more of a higher level framework than they are. And I kind of follow along the same lines as you do, Jeff, where you said, yeah, that's in PCI, yeah, that's in PCI. FISMA has kind of been my framework that I tend to work around when I look at other sets of compliance requirements. I think that many of the different compliance requirements that we see, there's a pretty significant overlap, and they all kind of organize it differently with a different goal, depending on the organization that puts it together. But I do think that and Identify that it is a goal to understand everything that needs to be protected. And perhaps I didn't explain that clearly enough.
And I think a little bit is it's not as prescriptive as like FIPS 199 to FIPS 200 in the federal space, right? You have a really good kind of classification framework in FIPS 199 to figure out which controls for FIPS 200 you have to deploy. It's not that specific, and I think that's where some people run into the challenge with this whole concept of the risk assessment. It's kind of embedded in the Identify domain, but it's not explicit, and it's not, I don't think, well crafted to make it easy for people to have a really good approach like a FIPS 199, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, it doesn't really explain to you how to conduct the risk assessment, for example, in the CSF. You have to go do more research on risk assessments and find
they do have downloadable templates and guides that you can actually download and go through, but again, they don't explain how to use them. They're just more for tracking and giving you insight into what you should be doing from a 10,000 foot view. We're going through a lot of issues where data classification would make things a lot clearer in our scoping for what we're doing for some of these compliance standards, but that's never been done. And there's not a really good, I agree with Jeff, there's not a really good explanation on how you should go about determining how to classify that information.
Scott, Josh, any questions? Comment?
Yeah, it starts off, NIST CSF starts off with identification of all your assets. NIST CSF starts off with a very classic, go out and do an asset inventory, go out and find out everything about your environment, go and do these things. So it is prescriptive to a certain extent, at least in that area. Now then, after that, you're right about, it doesn't really perform a risk assessment, but by the actual introduction to the NIST CSF, it's a risk management framework, not a risk assessment framework.
All right.
It is to determine your controls around your risk, not to assess your actual risk. So that's actually the in the introduction to it, I believe, although don't quote me on that. But the question I have for you guys is this. You listed out a lot of different things you can do. I'm generic here. And I love it, by the way. It was really good. Some of those I almost disagree with you on, not because you're wrong to include them, but because they're going to take, for a small to medium business, they're going to take a hell of a lot more effort or knowledge than they're going to have access to. It's just, let's be honest here. So what would you consider would be your first priority, and what kind of costs do you think are around that first, second, and third priority for a small to medium business? Any thoughts?
For me, the first priority would be putting in your security policies. Again, getting back to what data are you protecting, how critical is it, and what steps am I going to take to protect that? And that comes from the asset management and the risk assessment. Without that, the rest of all of the things that we suggest become very difficult to implement because you don't know what your target is.
And so is the recommendation there kind of like acceptable use, privacy, and then a base InfoSec policy? Are those kind of like the three minimums from a policy perspective you should put in place?
There's more.
Yeah, there's more to it than that, but basically what are you trying to protect first? What are we looking at? Are we looking at internal assets and your land? Are we looking at what's public facing? I guess you would have to sit down and scope what your priorities are. If it's intellectual property that is your secret sauce, then I would say you probably want to focus on protecting your internal assets, your land, where that corporate data is stored, how it's protected, what users have access to it, getting those least privileges from an internal or an end user perspective. And then if it's more public facing stuff, if you're dealing with information that's out there that the public can get at through the internet or other ways, then that's a different animal, I think.
And to add to what you're saying, a really good starting point is understanding what systems drive your business. Where does your revenue come from? Because without revenue, you can't do this thing called pay bills. You can't make payroll. You can't have everything else fall in line. Mm-hmm. So you start with your revenue systems. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes, I agree. I mean, you have to focus on your highest risk, highest value assets. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, there's no business if that stuff goes away.
How many of you have read the book called The Goal? That book talks the goal. The title came from what is the goal of every business, right? It's not security; it's to make money. Every business is a business to make money. What makes you your money? You're spot on. And if your goal is to go from being a privately held company to a publicly traded one, then you darn well better protect that financial generating system. And that's part of, covered in the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, but you might as well start working on that direction now rather than waiting until you have an offer on the table to buy your business.
So I had a sort of a follow-up question, that sort of on the finances and budget aspect, because I think most of us would agree that security at some level costs some amount of money. You mentioned a couple things throughout your presentation. The last thing that sort of triggered the question was talking about things that you can learn from asking friends, bouncing ideas off of friends, going to security conferences, which in most cases costs money. So, given that there needs to be some sort of budget, sort of a two-part question. Where the first part is, where does the budget come from in smaller organizations, or where should you look for budget? Maybe is the way to phrase the question. The second part of it is in terms of allocation. You have limited resources in terms of money. In your opinion, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious as what your thoughts are, because you guys have sort of implemented this in companies. What percentage of your budget goes towards, sort of actual, tools and solutions, as we like to call them in the vendor space, versus softer things like training, security awareness, or even something like going to conferences, sort of the miscellaneous. And maybe a third bucket would then be, and necessarily sometimes is paying for the assessors or the auditors to come in and tell you everything you're doing and not doing.
Sure, I'll go first. I think in terms of where does budget come from, this goes back to our discussion of management commitment, right? An organization has to realize, and maybe this happens at some point in their growth, and maybe they find out from, a business partner or a friend who had a ransomware event and what it cost them and how long they were down and the damage that it did, or something along those lines. They have to realize, I need to do more for information security. And then, they're going to have to decide what they want to spend on it. If they're a little bit bigger and they have an IT team, an in-house IT team, then maybe what you do is you take one of your IT professionals and carve out part of their time for security, for implementing some of these controls that we've talked about. In a larger organization, maybe it falls under the CIO and their budget. And a number that I've seen thrown around is 6%, 10%, somewhere in that range of total IT budget should be spent on security. Now, it's going to vary widely depending on what type of business you are, but I think that that's maybe something to start with. Certainly in where I'm sitting, I would like to see more of the IT budget spent on security than that amount, because as we all know, security is very expensive. And so this jumps into another part of the question is, where do you spend the money? Just buying the tools isn't going to make you secure. I really feel like it's people more than the tools. You need to have someone or a team of people who know how to use these tools and can do the care and feeding and the monitoring of your network in order to have a robust security program. Just because you have SIM, just because you have all this stuff in place, there's a lot of care and feeding involved in these tools and keeping them updated and weeding out pointless false alerts and really getting in to see what's going on, especially if you get to the depth. You're looking at what's going on in your network and you're running SIM. You have to have analysts who can understand all and cut through all the noise.
No, but artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to take care of all that. You don't need people anymore, right?
The more blinky lights, the more secure, right? One of the things we've noticed
we're quite there yet.
is, people will, for example, we use Active Directory. Part of our core values within the company is to provide a training budget for everyone in the company, not just the security team, not just the InfoSec team. Everybody gets a budget to go train. It's one of our core values. The always learning is the first core value of the company. So that budget's included in the corporate budget. It's not included in our security budget. As far as security budget, we're looking at about 15 to 18% of our corporate budget goes towards that, aside from training. But one of the things that we're very careful about is making sure that we're training people to use the tools that are already in place and not buying new tools that are covering gaps just because people haven't learned the existing tools that are in place. Example, Active Directory has something called App Locker built into it. How many companies out there actually use that to limit where applications can execute within their Active Directory network? I would say very few. Why would you pay money for an application whitelisting setup when you can actually learn to implement that very quickly? That's just one example.
Can I back you up a step? You used a percentage figure for the amount of money you spend on security. Do you mind going over that really quickly?
It's a decision that came down from the board and the C-level people. It's not my decision to make that number. That's just a number.
I'm not saying about whose decision it was. I'm curious about what your company decides is an appropriate percentage of budget to spend on security. Is that out of your entire revenue? Is that out of your IT budget? What is that out of, if you don't mind me asking?
I believe it's out of the entire budget for the entire company.
13? Did you say 13 to 15% of your budget goes to security?
15 to 18%. Yep, they take it very seriously.
18%.
Yep.
Wow, that's incredibly high.
Extremely seriously.
For a small to medium business, let's talk about this for a second. This is relevant to the small to medium business.
We're not a small and medium business anymore, so just qualify that.
Agreed and understood. But my question is, for small to medium business, let's talk about budgets. What percentage of their budget should be going to IT, should be going to security, that kind of thing? We're talking about things they can do. What should they be costing them?
So I would look at it a different way. I would set my prices on my services based on what my cost would be to ensure that I was secure. The problem most businesses make is they set a price that the market will bear and then try to fit security, shoehorn that into that budget somehow, rather than charging the price that they should charge for their service to ensure that security is adequately covered. So I'm not answering your question. I'm being the devil's advocate here.
No. And you're answering it beautifully. You're saying, charge what you need to make the money to make yourself secure. Yep. Of course, now I'm going to have to ask you, because I'm going to play devil's advocate too. Can you define secure, please?
Security is different for me than it is for you, right? So again, I mentioned this briefly. When I ask people what's enough security, my answer is always just enough. What assets am I trying to protect and to what level? So I'm not willing to spend more money to secure an asset than that asset is worth to my company. Unfortunately, many people don't understand what that value is, and they spend way more for the asset to secure it than the asset's worth to their company. And it goes back to what you talked about in the beginning, classifying the data to determine what's the value of that information or that asset.
Do you have a magical formula that an SMB could use to be able to define how much needs to be spent for their security to be considered
Just
good
enough.
enough. Yeah, good enough or just enough. Like, is there a magical formula? What are some of the pieces? Like, how would you attack that? If somebody said to you, "Hey, I'm going to give you a blank check, but it needs to be constrained to security," how are you figuring out what's going on that blank check?
If I could figure that out, I'd have the largest booth and the best parties at RSA.
Well, what I'm getting at is there are pieces of that equation which you two have been talking about, right? Mm-hmm. First is asset identification. Second is the level of security that you need to put on those assets and what tools are required, right? Third is figuring out which of those two equal protection against money-making utilities, right? Money-making systems, revenue-generating resources, right? So there is a way to hit that, right? And you guys have been touching on all of the pieces, and I think it's really important to point out that yes, it can be done. It's not mystical. You have to intrinsically figure it out, right? It's not something that's
simple.
Like
an employee gets a
easily
laptop.
discernible.
That laptop costs $2,000, right? How much would you spend to protect that laptop a year? Would you spend $4,000? I don't know. But if you've encrypted the data on it, the laptop got lost and there's nothing useful on it, I would never spend more than $2,000 in a year to protect that asset. Probably less than that, right?
Well,
but
your illustration
access to data assets that are worth far more.
Yeah,
correct.
Josh
But
and
if
I
it's
think are
encrypted
going
and
to say
somebody
the
loses
same
a laptop, I don't care. It's a brick.
Sorry, Jeff.
No, but we're jumping on the same thing. It's not the value of the hardware; it's the value of the data that resides on the hardware.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? So,
and this is why, because others have tried to do this with value at risk based systems, but a lot of these value at risk systems have not really taken off because it's a lot harder to calculate that value and to understand the risk profile on it than we're just anecdotally talking about, right? And I think that's one of the challenges is this concept of value at risk is not that easy to accomplish. Anybody who's attempted to do this in the past has definitely run into some struggles there. But that would potentially be one of these things that if you could put a value on that asset, then you could also say a percentage of that should be to protect the value of that asset and help you calculate a budget. Just much easier said than done.
Yeah, and I think for small businesses, it might be a little bit easier if they have a single service or two that they're offering and the assets or the data that they're looking at allow them to make that revenue, then they can assign a much higher value to that infrastructure or that data and give it a higher priority in their budget. But again, they're going to have to work that into what they're making versus the cost to offer that service. That's
right,
something
but you also
difficult.
have to take into account the amount of risk in the interaction with vendors and clients, right? Because vendors are going to have one amount associated. You're going to have your amount for the SMB associated, and then you're going to have the client's amount associated with that, right? Does that sound correct?
Mm-hmm. And we're actually seeing that more as we grow. More and more of our customers are requiring certain compliance standards before they'll do business with us. And that's a trend that has really just started. So from a small business perspective, if you're looking at trying to gather new revenue, you may be losing out on revenue if you don't meet certain compliance standards or aren't moving in certain directions to where you can give your customers the warm fuzzy that you meet a certain set of standards. So there you're losing revenue, right? So it doesn't matter about security at that point. You have to be able to justify if it costs us $100,000 to become SOC 2 compliant and we lost $1 million in business because we're not, that's a no-brainer decision. We're going to spend that $100,000 somehow to do that.
So in bridging what you're saying, breaking down silos and building bridges, right? Mm-hmm. In bridging what you're saying, how, and this is a question we've asked of other interviewees as well, how would you go about defining which compliance set you need to hit to protect your business, right? What is your thought process on the roadmap to make that happen?
Well, for us, it's twofold, right? We're publicly traded, so we have to meet legal compliance. That's first. Always, what is the regulatory compliance standard? So for us, Sarbanes-Oxley and all of our revenue reporting to the board and to the shareholders is paramount. Does that security? I don't know, but it's paramount for us to be able to run our business. We would have legal ramifications if we didn't do that. Second, then, is customer demand. What do the customers demand from us? What sort of standards do they require for us to be able to write business with them? And I think those two are the driving forces from the compliance side of things. And unfortunately, security plays into that in some regard, but you've heard the statement, compliance is the illusion of security in some regards, accepting PCI, Jeff. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer, and I think you're doing an admirable job. I'm intrigued by what you pointed out a little while ago, because I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that most companies don't, and I'm paraphrasing, don't factor in the true cost of doing business to include the cost of doing things securely and or compliant to what they build into the cost of whatever it is that they're producing, whatever they're selling. I think that's fascinating, and I can the arguments are spinning in my head already, because I can hear companies saying, well, we can't afford to do that because our competition isn't going to do it, and they're going to provide a cheaper solution, and we'll price ourselves out of the market, and we'll price ourselves out of business. And I think that drives a lot of people's perceptions that security is just simply too expensive to implement, which is where we start having these risk-based conversations, where, to me, a risk-based conversation is always, how little can we do and get away with it before something bad happens, and can we recover from the bad when it happens?
But I think
just
the guys,
security.
Right. But you guys also did, I thought, a really good job of identifying where some of the free tools are. There's nothing out there that says you have to pay for a SIM or pay for a vuln scanner or pay for a patching solution or pay for some of these other things. There are a lot of open source products out there. There are some free tools out there that you could build effective programs. And I think this goes back to one of the other points you guys made is, don't forget about the people, right? You need to make an investment in some people that understand security, understand how these tools work. You don't have to spend a fortune on tools if you have a really good set of resources, people resources internally that know how to bring these tools together and build your own security program. You can do it on the cheap. You don't have to buy the most expensive enterprise grade security solution to get a level of security in your environment.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree 110% with that statement. If I could jump in, I mentioned it before. In terms of what can you commit, and going back even to budget. If you have enough budget to have, let's say, an IT team of 3 people, in my opinion, I'd like to see one of those 3 people dedicated to security, and that person should be contributing to the community. They should be following a lot of folks in the community on Twitter to learn what everyone else is doing and seeing in the current standards, and they should be attending their local B-sides. You don't have to go to RSA and Black Hat to learn about security, right? Local events, practitioner conferences that are a lot more inexpensive are out there, and webinars and other programs like this can teach you a lot about security and about what needs to be done. So I think that, there are a lot of fairly inexpensive tools that, as long as you have a decent resource, you can implement a pretty significant security program. And I'll send the links to a couple of things. I wrote a paper that's on PeerList that has links to a lot of these free tools and sort of a minimum standard of things any company should do with regards to security. And my friend Klaus Haumann, who lives in the EU, wrote a similar paper called Minimum Viable Security when he was the CISO of a small bank in Luxembourg. He basically wrote out, here's a minimum set of things that, any small business should do. And I think, the requirement, though, is that they have to be big enough that they have some IT resources. If you don't have any IT resources, I think that's an entirely different podcast program for how do you do security with a mom and pop shop. We're talking really about you do have some IT resources here.
I had a sort of a random, well, it's not random, a sort of a tangential question. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts about it. Yeah, again, sort of on the theme of small companies don't have a lot of budget. They're trying to do as much as they can with freeware and free solutions. In recent years past, when I was more actively doing assessment work, a big issue was bring your own device, primarily smartphones. Nowadays, I think it's a combination of BYOD and let's put everything out in the cloud. Just your impressions. Do programs that promote sort of, the illusion or the reality of free or very cheap hardware and information assets or information technology assets, if you will, do they help or hurt ultimately small programs that are trying to do things with security?
I think two things come into play. What's the learning curve on learning how to implement and manage that free thing that you're putting in place, right? Versus buying that service from somebody else. And the next thing is it really effective? Is it really giving you, based on the time and investment that you're doing? Because let's face it, everybody has the same amount of time every day, 24 hours, right? And not everybody wants to work 24 hours a day. So am I getting an investment back for the time that I'm investing into using that free service? Because nothing's free, right? Your time costs you money. So, and there's two factors to that cost. There's the cost of the time that actually took you to do it, and the other factor is the opportunity cost, the cost that you lost by not doing something else. And most people don't put that into play when they're figuring out the true cost of a free solution. So I don't know if that's
well said. Well said.
Looking forward to.
Thank you.
Hey, great. Hey, we're about up on time today. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate you guys coming and sort of giving us some practical things to think about in terms of implementing security. Probably some lessons in here for larger companies as well. Parting shots for Russell and Jim. If you could only do three things, what would be the first three things you would do? Cost notwithstanding, but in terms of the importance of things, what are the three things that you would do to secure your organization? Start with you, Russell, and we'll end with Jim.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I wish you'd given me that one in advance. I have a lot.
You can always pass and let Jim answer first.
Well, I'll take a quick swing at it. The top three things I think I'm going to go back to. You have to have some commitment from management. If you can't convince management that security is important, you're going to lose. Second thing is it's time in getting those policies written, because all of your controls and everything are going to be based on your policies. And then for me, the third thing is that resource. You need a security analyst, security engineer to help you put these things in place and to maintain them. The care and feeding is so important. Just the tools alone don't get you security. You have to have people who know how to use them and keep them current and tell you and the other folks in your organization what the tools are telling them.
All right, Jim, you can simply concur, or do you have any difference in your top three?
Well, I was assuming that we'd have management buy-in and budget and all of that sort of thing and the right personnel to do this. So I was looking more from the technical side. First thing and foremost is vulnerability and patch management. Make sure your stuff is patched. I mean, that tends to be the last thing that people deal with, and make sure you keep track of the exceptions of the things that you cannot patch, and make sure you put controls in place that mitigate the vulnerabilities that are in those things that you cannot patch. Second is lock down your network. Don't let people bring devices from other outside locations onto your corporate network. And third would be, have goals, right? Our company has instituted something called OKRs. I don't know if you ever read the book Measure What Matters by John Doerr, but it's probably worth reading. I think everybody that's working in an IT business should read that book and figure out how to use them to stay on track and keep your focus. So those three things.
All right, great. Hey, Russell and Jim, thanks so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation and the presentation. We will make sure any links that you want to send to us, Russell, we'll update them on the wiki so you guys can go there to check things out. Also, if you're just listening on the podcast and you want to see their slides, they have a lot of good information on the slides if you want to tune in at some point to the webcast. Other than that, go out there and try to be secure and compliant, and we'll see you after Thanksgiving. Thanks a lot.
Have a happy Thanksgiving.